Remain standing in body or in spirit for the reading of the gospel from the 6th chapter of John, verses 1 through 21. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he knew himself what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got in a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they went to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. It is really good to be back among you today, though a little odd to walk in these doors with my kid, who's 1 and asking for dada constantly. And many of you still may believe that my husband is a figment of my imagination. He is real, but he is on his way to North Carolina with a group of youth for the Presbyterian equivalent of Green Lake. So maybe you believe me then. But my son will be available for gawking later. He's cute. He has 1,000,000 teeth. So it is good to be among you. You don't look a day older than when I left 4 years ago. So this story from John, really it's a collection of stories about miracles. I used to pray for miracles all the time when I was younger, much younger. I would read these stories of people who had just a little bit of faith, and they would pray and they would be healed, taking up their mats and walking, or the woman who would touch the edge of Jesus' shirt and be healed and changed. And I would think, surely I believe that much. And yet the miracles never seemed to come. I loved the story of Jesus walking on water, calming the storm, raising Lazarus from the dead. I prayed for miracles in the face of some of my biggest fears as a kid: tornadoes, death, the deep end of the pool. So I believed, along with my Bible reading, that if I had just a little bit of faith, I wouldn't have to be afraid, because Jesus would make all of these things go away. And then later, in high school, when I was very sick, I prayed and I prayed and I begged and I bargained for a miracle. But that never happened. Or at least it didn't happen in the way that I expected or I wanted or the way that I asked for. So I convinced myself this was a matter of faith and that I just didn't have enough, or I didn't love God enough, or I didn't believe enough. Maybe I didn't know enough, and so maybe I should study more because, after all, I was pretty good at school and I liked to read, so maybe I should do that a little more. And so although the miracles never came, these stories of the overwhelming, miraculous, weird work of Jesus remain some of my favorite stories. So we pick up this story, we hear that crowds are following Jesus around. And I kind of think of the Kardashians, if you'll indulge me a little bit, who can't go anywhere without crowds of people following them around. Because many have seen, now not that the Kardashians are miraculous and like Jesus, the metaphor ends there. But so many have seen what Jesus is doing, even more have heard of the signs that he has done. And up to this point, he's turned water into wine at a wedding. He'd met a Samaritan woman at the well, and she reported that he told her everything she'd ever done. He'd raised an official's son from the dead at Capernaum. He heals the paralyzed man in Bethesda. Among other things that this gospel writer tells us he's done, people are getting the message. They're starting to gather and just follow him around. So this 6th chapter begins, and the people are gathered. Many, many people, thousands of people. What seems obvious to Jesus as he looks up to see the crowds gathering is that they must be fed, and this is church at its best. Of course, we may not know much, but we know there should be food. I mean, that's in the gospel right here. So he asks Philip, who I presume was just the disciple that happened to be standing closest to him, or maybe he was the treasurer, I don't know. But he asked Philip, how in the world are we going to afford to feed all these people? And Philip pulls out the budget, crunches the numbers, and declares that even if they had half a year's worth of wages and pledges turned in, we wouldn't even be able to give them a snack. Andrew, apparently, this again, you start to unpack the story, so weird, so funny. Andrew has already raided the crowd and has found a child's snack. Well, this kid has some bread and fish. And before we go anywhere else with this, Jesus says, okay, wait, make them sit down. Of all the things the gospel writer chooses to include in the story, I love that it was important that Jesus makes 5,000 men and just as many women and children sit down. You're not going to get any food until you're seated, right? I have a kid now, and I get it. Like, no. We know what happens when you're walking around with food, and that's not a good situation. So they bring the contents of the young boy's lunchbox, and then Jesus takes the bread and blesses it and breaks it and feeds those that are gathered. Does that language sound familiar? He takes the bread, blesses it, breaks it, and feeds people. That language, those actions, that's no accident that those sound familiar to us. So I like to imagine the disciples are just still fretting, huddled up, trying to come up with a plan over in their little corner. They're trying to organize. And meanwhile, Jesus is over here having multiplied loaves and fishes and has already begun feeding these thousands of people. By the time that this group of disciples over here has firmly decided that this is just not possible, it's not going to happen, Jesus comes over and says, gather up what's left over because the people have been fed and there is plenty left over. Can you imagine the faces of the disciples? Jesus, we've decided this isn't, there's leftovers, can you go ahead and pack those up? Like, okay. So they gather up the leftovers. They have 12 full baskets. Now that number, of course, is symbolic, but also what a powerful vision of abundance and a miracle, another sign for those that have followed Jesus to this point, that they believe in the sacred presence among them, a sacred presence who recognizes and insists that their bellies be filled before their spirits are filled. So then the crowd's response. I don't think it's exactly what Jesus wanted or expected, maybe, because it says he withdraws. The crowd wants to take him by force. Sounds like an appropriate way to give thanks for the food. To take him by force and make him king. They are so amazed at what he has done for them in front of them, and they want to immediately elevate him in status and power. Again, all he did was give you some bread. They must have been very hungry. So Jesus wants none of that and goes to the mountain. Meanwhile, still not sure what the disciples are doing, clearly not a significant detail for John. At any rate, we skip ahead in the story, and next we see that the disciples, they're going out to sea. They're getting in a boat and heading back to Capernaum. And we know that Jesus isn't with them. What we aren't sure of is, have they forgotten him? Or has some other conversation happened where Jesus says, I need some more me time, you guys go ahead. So they do. So they go out to sea, and predictably, the waters get rough. This always seems to happen in the Bible. They go out to sea and meet up with some rough water. Have you ever been out in open waters and encountered strong winds? Me too. So many of you know this, and I've already kind of alluded to this, but my husband, Zach, is a youth pastor in Prairie Village. 4 years ago, it was the same summer after my last Sunday here, and I had a little bit of time between, I like to say that I was unemployed. It was, between things. But I went up to the Quetico and the Boundary Waters with some of his youth and some other chaperones for a canoeing camping trip with the youth group. So this was before we were married. We actually had only been engaged for about 3 days when the trip left. And so that was really fun, riding in a canoe, middle of nowhere. What kind of reception do you want? He was like, I don't care. What I was unprepared for on this trip was how much hiking and navigating mud and hills and all of that one does on a canoe trip. These places where you have to cross land to continue on into the canoe are called portages, or as our Canadian border ranger called them, portage. So now I can't ever just hear portage. One particular day, we had just made it over a rather rough portage, and we were about to pack up and head on into the canoes going on, knowing we were that much closer. We could see the bit of land where we planned to stay. But as we looked out over the water, we saw waves developing. We saw the sky getting darker. And I, for one, was choosing to listen to my fear. Fear that was masked, of course, as very practical wisdom. Like, we're just going to stay put. We'll camp right here. It was a dumb idea. There was not even enough land for one tent, let alone the 3 or 4 that we had. But I was convinced that I was smart, right? But Zach insisted we needed to go, and we needed to go right now. And so he and another student got in their canoe and left. And the rest of us were kind of like, well, I guess we're going. And so we did. We got to the part of the water that feels like you're about as far away from where you were as where you're going. So it was no turning back, right? And I looked toward the campsite that was our destination, and I see lightning. Mind you, I am the only adult with 2 students in a metal canoe. I like to make sure that detail gets told. So I look out, I see lightning. I look over here and I see my newly minted fiance, and I'm thinking, well, that was fun while it lasted. And was just convinced that we weren't even going to get to see the rest of our lives. I have never been more afraid or more mad. And I really could have used Jesus walking on that water and telling me not to be afraid or saying, peace, be still. But to this day, this is one of our favorite stories to tell, and mostly because Zach likes to say, how did it end? And it ended with a clear evening and one of the best campsites of the whole week. So he was right. So that's my story about the rough waters. So I get it. Here are the disciples just in this boat 3 or 4 miles away. That's a long way on water, and it's rough, and they're scared. And here comes Jesus, right? Kind of like what they want and what they're most afraid of. Because here comes Jesus. He's been walking on water for 3 or 4 miles. Yeah, exactly. And not only has he been walking on water for 3 or 4 miles, but he's been walking on the sea faster than the disciples are rowing their boat. Yeah. That's like a double miracle right there. And like bonus, right? It's like he fed all these people. Also, he ran on the water for 3 or 4 miles faster than the boat was moving. That's really fast. And so the disciples, though, they're even more afraid. There's storm, intruder, walking on water. Like, it's okay that we don't feel like, because I think a lot of times we're like, oh, the disciples, they're so silly. I totally am with them here, right? And then Jesus says, it is I. Do not be afraid. And then they get to land and the story's over. It's weird. So I will tell you this, that these stories haven't gotten any less odd or any easier to explain the more I've sat with them, prayed about them, thought about them. Sometimes the more you think about these stories, the weirder they really are. So often I just kind of think, yeah, Jesus was just kind of odd a lot of the time. So how am I supposed to explain or understand what he's up to? I kind of think that's the point. It's just mysterious. So the trouble with miracles, to me, is that they are so often pretty distracting. I read them, and they so rarely seem to offer me anything helpful for my faith, and instead, more often, they, at minimum, fail to impress me, or at most, just offer me more challenge, shoving me farther from belief, because why doesn't that stuff seem to happen for me or other people that I care about and love? So what do? We find natural explanations, like, well, he wasn't really walking on the water, or maybe the boat was going backwards and he would, we find ways to rationalize them. And here we are in 2018, and we know so much more now, right? We know more than the disciples knew, because we're in our postmodern, post-enlightenment world, and we don't even wonder at these stories anymore. So maybe in reading these texts, we aren't supposed to come away with an understanding of the facts of the story. Maybe those are the distraction. What if we're wasting our time by trying to explain how 5 loaves and 2 fish fed at least 10,000 people? And what if we're wasting our time by trying to comprehend how Jesus walked miles on water faster than his disciples could row their boat? Instead, what if these stories are a reminder to us to marvel and a challenge to us to trust? To shrug at our own lack of enough? God doesn't seem to operate, after all, according to our rules of counting and quantifying. So we should be challenged, I would like to propose, to find the miracle of life and grace that permeates our very existence. What I have come away from these stories with, more than any kind of textbook explanation, is conviction in the face of my own anxiety and doubt. Do you see the disciples off to the side, hand-wringing, worrying, studying their numbers and trends? They're convinced at their own facts, convinced that it's just impossible. They're trusting in their own understanding, which is to say they are certain that they are stuck, which is to say they are fretting because they are convinced there is no way out and no way through. Meanwhile, Jesus is operating in abundance. Jesus is feeding people. Jesus is transforming what those around him, the crowds, the disciples, assume that they already know. The story of Jesus feeding the crowd calls us to trust in the day ahead of us, the moments that we are given, instead of trusting our own anxieties and doubts, which is frustrating because trusting in anxiety and doubt most of the time is so much easier than trusting in anything else. I'm pretty good at trusting in anxiety and doubt. I'm really good at it, actually. We may think that we don't have enough time, patience, money, love, skill, whatever it is. But this story challenges us with God's own truth that our not enough is God's abundance. Indeed, our claim of it's not enough, there'll never be enough for me, I'm running out of time, we're not going to have this, is never the final answer for God. Here's the thing. I need this reminder. And I like how Nadia Bolz-Weber puts it. Nothing is God's favorite material to work with. Nothing is God's favorite material to work with. And really, how often do we actually come to God with nothing? Because we have something. We have ourselves, at the very least. Imagine what God can do if we come holding our something, little, feeble as it may be, and that we look at it and say, it's not enough. We couple that with a little bit of faith, a little bit of hope, and that we will find that God can turn that into more than enough. Isn't that so much easier said than done? Isn't that nice to hear that? And then you have to go back out into the real world. So I can imagine Philip and Andrew and the rest somewhat relieved, maybe temporarily empowered when Jesus asked them the question, how will we afford this ministry? And Philip is like, going to crunch his numbers, and Andrew's going to do a gifts inventory, and they're like, this is what we signed up for. He's finally using my resume. But Jesus, though, he's like, I don't need that, or I don't need much of that. Instead, all he asks them for is participation. For participation in transformation and abundant sharing. For those of you who help lead this church or lead wherever you lead, did you sign up to participate in a miracle? Be honest with yourself. You don't have to answer out loud. Because what would our work look like? How would we be transformed if we constructed all we did to point to God's abundance in response to human hunger? What would our community, our nation, our world look like if we trusted in abundance instead of our own anxiety? Listen, I'm still praying for miracles all the time. And I can look back on my childlike approach and the things that I wanted God to heal or fix or take away, and I can laugh at those things, but I'm still very much that child wanting God just to make things better. More than ever, really. Because I look around, like most of you, and I watch the news or quickly turn the news off. I read headlines and see pictures on social media, and friends, I want something better. I want something better than the rhetoric that is so finely tuned to messages of fear and anxiety and distrust. I don't want to be an us or a them. But we are so saturated with it that I don't know how to stop it. I'm looking for compassion and empathy, and I only seem to be finding hard hearts, closed doors, and wall building. And I find myself living into my own privilege of turning off the news, of shutting it out. And I'm acknowledging that I know that that is not okay and that is not enough. Because people are hurting. Families have been broken. We have created orphans. And our earth is aching for healing. And it seems like now more than ever, I could use a miracle or two. We could use a miracle or two. So I am putting myself right at the center of this. I and we need to leave this fretful huddle of worry and planning and instead need to sidle over to where Jesus is, who's doing the work of feeding and compassion and proclaiming, stop being afraid. I want to know what we're going to do. I want to know how we are going to show up for the miracle of abundance and transformation and peace. Be still. It's not enough for me to worry and be horrified as I open the news and then quickly turn away. I want to be a follower of Jesus, and that does mean walking directly where there is need, sharing what may seem like scarce resources and finding abundance. What would it look like to approach our work with open hearts, minds, open hands to the transformative word of God? As we pray for miracles and as you listen along with me to the story of Jesus, promising us that God is surprising and beautiful, abundant and present. And I'm not leaving you with any answers today. Not that I have answers at all, but I always like to leave with some kind of so here's something we could go do. And I'm not quite there yet. And so I'm honest about that. I'm not sure what this looks like in a world that feels so fragmented and so broken and so needy. But I do share, hopefully I share with you, a desire for miracles, a desire for transformation of everything that's permeating what we know to be broken. And a promise from God that when we pay attention and open ourselves up to this work, that miracles do happen. Thanks be to God.